January 1945, somewhere west of the Rhine. The landscape lay under a low ceiling of winter cloud, the kind that swallowed sound and flattened every horizon. Dawn had not yet formed a clear line, only a faint gray wash drifting across the frozen fields. In the half-light, a column of German Panthers moved cautiously along a narrow farm road, their engines rumbling in slow, restrained intervals. Frost clung to every bolt and edge of armor, turning the tanks into ghostly silhouettes against the pale ground. Inside one turret, the crew strained to see beyond the misted periscope glass. Nothing. No muzzle flashes, no aircraft, no shapes moving along the distant tree line. The battlefield felt empty, almost unnervingly so. The commander lifted his binoculars, scanning again. Still nothing. Then, without warning, a distant thud rolled across the plains. Not close, far away, too far to see. A second followed, then a third. Before the commander could issue a single order, the first shell struck somewhere ahead, its impact echoing through the fog like a hammer hitting the earth. The German crew froze, realizing they were being targeted by guns they could not even glimpse, guns firing from beyond sight. And to understand how this moment became possible, we need to step back into the war that created it. To understand how German tank crews in 1945 found themselves under fire from guns positioned far beyond their visual horizon, we must return to the shifting reality of the Western Front as the Third Reich entered its final year. By early 1944, German armor doctrine, once the sharp edge of blitzkrieg, was increasingly strained by attrition, fuel shortages, and an ever-growing mismatch in combined arms capabilities. What remained of Germany's tank forces fought with skill, but under worsening strategic conditions. They faced an enemy whose technological coordination, rather than any single weapon, had quietly transformed the balance of power. For most of the war, tank combat had been defined by direct fire. Crews sought to identify targets visually, maneuver into advantageous terrain, and strike with guns whose effectiveness depended on line-of-sight accuracy. German training emphasized high-precision gunnery, range estimation, and the use of optics that had earned worldwide respect. A Panther or Tiger crew generally trusted that if they could not see an enemy, the enemy could not accurately engage them. But American doctrine evolved on a different path. While U.S. armor divisions developed effective tank versus tank strategies, it was the artillery corps that became the silent backbone of the Allied advance. American ground forces, supported by vast industrial production, fielded thousands of guns from 105mm howitzers to the heavier 155mm pieces, all backed by a sophisticated system of communication, mapping, and forward observation. By late 1944, the U.S. Army had achieved a level of indirect fire precision unmatched by any other combatant. The difference was not only in firepower but in method. American artillery batteries operated like a machine, flexible, fast, and coordinated by radio networks that allowed infantry officers, air observers, or reconnaissance scouts to call for fire within minutes. German forces often claimed that American guns answered faster than questions could be asked. What they meant was simple. American artillery had mastered the ability to react almost instantly, hitting targets even before those targets fully understood they had been detected. Mapping played a critical role. American units carried standardized, grid-based topographical maps, pre-calculated firing tables, and the benefit of reliable logistics that delivered ammunition in quantities Germany could no longer match. Fire direction centers, specialized teams trained to convert coordinates into firing solutions, enabled batteries to strike positions they could not see on terrain they had never laid eyes on. By contrast, German artillery doctrine required more rigid procedures and often lacked compatible communication links across different branches. Priority of fire frequently went to defensive infantry operations, leaving armored units with less support and slower response times. As the Wehrmacht retreated across France and Belgium after the summer of 1944, the once feared panzer divisions became increasingly exposed to American artillery that seemed capable of reaching them from anywhere. Terrain amplified this imbalance. Northern France, Belgium, and the Western German plains contained broad, open fields, shallow ridges, and villages spaced at predictable intervals, ideal for indirect fire. German tank commanders, used to forests or rolling hills shielding them from distant guns, found that in this environment, even a slight elevation could conceal an American battery positioned miles back. Compounding this, American forward observers, often perched in church towers, upper floors of damaged farmhouses, or reconnaissance aircraft, could relay target coordinates without revealing their location. A panther rolling into a field might be under watch the moment it moved, even though the crew saw only stillness. By late 1944, German reports increasingly described unseen artillery or batteries firing from invisible positions. The language was not exaggeration, but frustration. Crews could not identify the direction of fire, could not hear incoming rounds early enough, and could not retaliate with their own guns. The psychological impact was significant. A tank built for duels now faced an opponent it could not fight back against. Even the experienced crews of elite units admitted their discomfort. Indirect fire was not supposed to be a tank's threat. Tanks were built to fight other tanks or infantry with direct weapons. As the U.S. Army pushed deeper toward the German frontier, American artillery, guided by accurate intelligence and reinforced by ample ammunition, became the decisive factor in engagements where German armor otherwise might have dominated. This evolution of American fire support created the conditions for the moment in January 1945 when German tank crews found themselves pinned down by shells fired from guns positioned far beyond sight. The question now becomes, how exactly did American artillery reach this level of precision, and why were German armored forces so vulnerable to it? To understand why American artillery could strike armor targets from beyond sight with such consistency, we must examine the deeper structure behind it, the doctrine, engineering, and battlefield systems that matured over years of refinement. None of this happened overnight. It was the product of lessons learned during the First World War, adapted to the mobility and pace of the Second. By 1944 to 45, the U.S. Army had perfected a method of war that fused communication, mathematics, and industrial capacity into a force multiplier unparalleled on the battlefield. At the core of this system stood the Fire Direction Center, a uniquely American innovation. It functioned as the brain of every artillery battalion. When a forward observer called in a target, whether from a hillside, a reconnaissance jeep, or a spotter aircraft, the center immediately began converting raw information into a firing solution. This process involved trained crews who could plot coordinates, calculate range and elevation, apply weather adjustments, and issue firing commands in minutes. German artillery units possessed skilled crews, but their system lacked the same degree of decentralization and flexibility. U.S. fire control allowed any observer to call upon multiple batteries simultaneously, enabling mass fire that struck with overwhelming speed. Equally important was the American emphasis on radio communication. Portable radios, though bulky by modern standards, expanded rapidly through infantry, armored, and airborne units. German forces, constrained by material shortages and by a doctrine that concentrated radios in command vehicles, found themselves at a disadvantage. Their armored units often had excellent internal communication, but struggled to coordinate seamlessly across branches, especially when retreat or rapid movement disrupted established lines. American artillery also benefited from air observation posts, known as L-4 Grasshoppers, small, slow aircraft that provided an extraordinary advantage. They flew low, sometimes barely above treetops, watching German movements and relaying coordinates. German tank crews often spotted these aircraft too late or not at all. A single observer in the sky could adjust fire for multiple batteries scattered miles apart. Even when weather-grounded larger aircraft, these light planes could still operate, giving American gunners near-constant awareness of what lay beyond hills and forests. Then came the role of sound ranging and flash spotting, techniques refined since World War I. By triangulating the sound of enemy guns or identifying muzzle flashes at night, American units could pinpoint German positions and pre-register firing data. Conversely, German forces increasingly lacked the resources and equipment to conduct similar operations effectively. As the war progressed, the U.S. added new tools, better survey equipment, improved firing tables, and precise topographical maps, allowing gunners to hit positions without ever seeing them. Logistics amplified everything. American supply lines ensured that ammunition arrived in staggering volume. A typical U.S. division in 1944 to 45 could fire thousands of rounds in a single day, something German units could rarely match. While German tank crews might fire a limited number of armor-piercing shells due to shortages, American artillery crews operated without such constraints. The result was a battlefield environment where U.S. guns could afford to saturate areas, adjust fire, and continue striking until the target was neutralized. As retreat compressed German forces toward the Rhine, terrain began favoring the Americans. The flat approaches, open agricultural fields, and long sight lines, even if obscured by fog, allowed American batteries to position themselves on ridges or behind towns, concealed from German eyes, but perfectly mapped on the grid systems used by observers. A panther rolling into the open became a marked coordinate rather than a distant visual target. These combined elements, communication, observation, calculation, and logistical depth, formed a lethal chain. By the winter of 1944 to 45, German tank crews faced an enemy that could strike from miles away, annihilating vehicles before they could orient themselves or return fire. What had once been a contest of armor and optics became a contest of information and reach. In this new reality, even the most experienced German crews found themselves exposed. They no longer feared only what lay ahead. They feared what lay far beyond their own field of view. And it is within this environment that several key angles emerge, each revealing how this transformation shaped the experience of both sides. For German tank crews, the battlefield was normally a place of direct sensory engagement. They relied on sight, sound, and instinct, peering through optics, scanning for threats, listening for engines or distant armor. Their world was defined by what they could observe from inside a steel machine. But by late 1944, that world had changed. The threat was no longer something they could see. It was something that arrived unannounced, traveling along arcs invisible to the human eye, guided by mathematics, maps, and observers they never spotted. Inside a Panther or Panzer IV, the crew's environment was already tense. The space was cramped, visibility was limited to narrow periscopes and small vision slits, and engines drowned out subtle sounds. A sudden hit was terrifying even when combat was expected. But the psychological strain grew worse when the strike came without warning. No muzzle flashes, no enemy silhouettes, no clues. A tank could be advancing confidently across a field, only to be shattered in an instant by a shell fired from a battery hidden miles beyond the nearest ridge. Veteran crews, who had survived battles from Normandy to the Ardennes, spoke of this change in their diaries and post-war accounts. They described the unsettling sense that the battlefield had become quiet and hostile at the same time. A calm moment meant nothing anymore. Nothing visible indicated danger. Even the most disciplined crews found themselves straining to interpret distant thumps, wondering if they were friendly, irrelevant, or already meant for them. Young, inexperienced crews suffered even more. They entered combat expecting duels with Shermans or confrontations with infantry. Instead, the first American weapon to engage them might be a 155 millimeters shell bursting near their position. And because indirect fire struck from above or at steep angles, it sometimes hit the thinner armor of the roof or sides, areas far less protected than the thick frontal plates German tanks relied on. This sense of helplessness chipped away at morale. German training emphasized initiative, confidence, and technical proficiency. But no amount of skill could compensate for an unseen gun line firing, based on coordinates calculated far from the front. The crew inside did not hear the whistle of incoming shells early enough to react. The first sign might be a violent jolt, a sudden shock that knocked tools loose, stunned the loader, or cracked periscopes. The psychological toll was cumulative. Commanders grew cautious, sometimes overly so. Drivers hesitated to cross open terrain. Gunners scanned empty horizons with growing frustration. The battlefield felt as though it was listening to them, watching them, while they themselves remained blind to the forces shaping their fate. For crews who had trained to fight visible enemies with precision and courage, being struck from beyond sight felt like losing control over their own craft. And this shift in human perception reflected an even larger shift on the battlefield itself. At the tactical level, the transformation was equally profound. German armor doctrine had been built around the principle of decisive maneuver. Tanks advanced with supporting infantry, artillery, and engineers, using terrain to outflank or overwhelm defenders. Commanders relied on reconnaissance units to identify enemy locations and used mobility to strike weak points. For much of the early war, this system worked efficiently. But American combined arms doctrine disrupted the entire equation. U.S. forces learned to integrate artillery not as a separate branch, but as an ever-present companion to infantry and armor. This meant that even small American units could access enormous indirect firepower. A platoon pinned by a German Panther could radio for support and receive accurate fire within minutes. German tactical manuals had not prepared crews to face an enemy whose artillery answered faster than its tanks. Indirect fire proved especially lethal on constricted terrain. When German armor advanced along narrow roads, American observers positioned on distant ridges could map the route and pre-register firing coordinates. When the column reached a predicted location, it entered a lethal zone without ever seeing the observers who directed the barrage. In open fields, American gunners used range tables and pre-surveyed firing positions to blanket a target area, forcing German tanks to halt, disperse, or retreat. The synergy between American infantry and artillery further amplified the effect. Infantry squads carried radios capable of communicating directly with fire direction centers. When they spotted German armor moving toward their lines, they did not need to wait for tanks or anti-tank guns. They simply transmitted coordinates and watched as artillery engaged the threat long before a visual confrontation became possible. German countermeasures, smoke, rapid maneuver, or attempts to overrun enemy positions were increasingly ineffective. Smoke often revealed movement rather than concealing it. Maneuver on muddy winter roads slowed armored units at critical moments. And attacking forward observers was nearly impossible, as many operated from hidden elevated positions or aircraft. The battlefield had shifted from a contest of weapons to a contest of information. American artillery had more data, better communication, and faster processing. German armor had superior optics and firepower in direct combat, but direct combat was no longer the primary arena. Tanks that could destroy a Sherman at long range found themselves destroyed by guns they never fired upon. And as this tactical reality became clear, deeper angles emerged, technological and leadership dynamics that shaped the outcome of these encounters. Beneath the dramatic battlefield moments lay the cold, methodical technology that made them possible. American artillery effectiveness in 1944-45 was not simply the result of powerful guns. It was the product of a systematic fire control network decades ahead of what many armies still used. The key was precision. Every gun crew, every fire direction center, every observer relied on standardized calculations and tools that allowed a battery to fire with mathematical accuracy at positions never visible to them. At the heart of this precision were firing tables created by the U.S. Army's Ballistic Research Laboratory. These tables accounted for elevation, charge type, humidity, temperature, wind, and even barrel wear. While German crews were often highly skilled at direct fire gunnery, American indirect fire operated on standardized data that allowed any gun, anywhere, to be part of an integrated system. Survey units provided exact location coordinates for every artillery piece. This meant that guns did not need to see their target. They needed only its coordinates. When American observers transmitted those coordinates, The Fire Direction Center performed calculations using slide rules, plotting boards, and training that allowed results to be produced in minutes or even seconds. German units, suffering shortages in trained artillery officers and equipment, could not match the speed or consistency. Another technological factor was the reliability of American radio systems, such as the SCR-610 and SCR-300. These radios created a real-time network across infantry, artillery, and armor. German forces, despite having excellent tank radios, lacked equivalent cross-branch connectivity. In many cases, tank commanders were unaware that they had been spotted by a forward observer miles away. Their position instantly transmitted to a fire direction center connected to a battalion of howitzers waiting for a new grid reference. Supporting all of this was aerial observation, particularly the L-4 Grasshopper aircraft. These small planes carried no weapons, yet they were among the most feared tools on the battlefield. Flying low and slow, they could pinpoint tank movements and adjust fire with extraordinary accuracy. A German tank crew often never saw the aircraft, only the shells that followed. This technological synergy did not merely enhance American firepower. It reshaped the battlefield into a place where visibility no longer dictated vulnerability. Leadership played a decisive role in transforming American artillery into a dominant force. Figures like General Leslie J. McNair, chief architect of the U.S. Army's Ground Forces Doctrine, emphasized flexibility, standardization, and the empowerment of lower-level officers. Artillery support was not to be hoarded at high command. It was to be made accessible to those who needed it most, the infantrymen and armored units at the front. This mindset filtered through every echelon. Battalion commanders learned to operate with delegated authority, trusting fire direction centers and forward observers to shape engagements. American training focused on synchronization. Artillery would soften positions before infantry advanced, or rapidly shift fire to protect a retreating unit. German commanders, constrained by dwindling resources and rigid chains of command, struggled to match this agility. In practice, this leadership approach meant that American artillery was always present, even when unseen. When tank columns approached American-held ground, local commanders often anticipated enemy movement based on reconnaissance and intelligence. They would pre-register artillery concentrations on likely approach routes. For German tank units, this meant that their movements were predicted before they even arrived at certain positions. Leadership failures on the German side were equally consequential. As the war turned against Germany, armored commanders were frequently forced to deploy tanks in defensive roles they were not designed for. High command increasingly treated armored divisions as fire brigades, rushing them to plug gaps regardless of terrain, support, or visibility. Without coordinated artillery or air cover, these tanks became vulnerable not to American armor, but to American indirect fire. Commanders in the field recognized the danger. Some wrote warnings about advancing over open terrain without reconnaissance. Others requested additional artillery support or smoke rounds. But with Germany's logistical collapse deepening, these requests often went unanswered. Thus leadership, its strengths on the American side and its limitations on the German, played a crucial role in shaping how unseen guns came to dominate the battlefield. Beyond the physical damage inflicted by American artillery lay a more subtle impact: the moral and psychological shock imposed on German tank crews and infantry. Soldiers trained for direct confrontations could accept what they saw. Fear in the face of machine gun fire or tank duels had a clear source. But when death came from a horizon that offered no warning, no visual cue, and no chance to retaliate, it produced a different kind of fear, anxiety not about strength or weakness, but about uncertainty. Reports from German armored units in late 1944 described this experience with striking consistency. Crews repeatedly used terms like Plötzlich, sudden, abrupt, to describe incoming fire. They spoke of the battlefield as a place where the air itself turned hostile, where silence felt dangerous because artillery might already be adjusting its range. This unpredictability eroded discipline. Drivers hesitated. Commanders avoided open ground, even when orders demanded speed. Some crews began advancing in shorter bursts, stopping to scan terrain that held no visible threat. The fear was not of American tanks. It was of American knowledge. The sense that the enemy knew their movements before they did, that the battlefield was mapped and measured in ways they could not counter, weighed heavily on morale. For American troops, the effect was inverse. Knowing that artillery could be summoned quickly bolstered their confidence. Infantry attacks were launched with the reassurance that unseen allies stood behind them. Tank crews advanced knowing they could request fire support before they engaged. This asymmetry increased the strategic gap between the two armies. By winter 1945, German forces often felt they were fighting a battle directed by someone watching them from the sky or from beyond hills they could not reach. And this perception set the stage for the events that would follow. The specific moments when American guns struck German armor from beyond sight with decisive effect. By February 1945, the winter fog along the Western Front had become both a shield and a trap. German commanders attempting to shift armored units toward collapsing sectors relied heavily on low visibility to conceal movement. On paper, the plans seemed sound. Move tanks under cloud cover, avoid Allied aircraft, and regroup before American forces could react. But the battlefield had changed. Visibility no longer dictated safety. Shortly after first light, a German Panther company rolled toward a shallow ridge near the town of Oberkirch. Their orders were clear: reach the high ground, secure the crossroads, and hold until reinforcements arrived. The terrain appeared empty. No American armor. No infantry. No aircraft overhead. Only the muted rumble of engines and the soft crackle of frost breaking beneath steel tracks. Unseen to the Germans, however, an American forward observer from the 94th Infantry Division had been monitoring the valley. Hidden inside a shattered farmhouse nearly 2 miles away, he carefully plotted each movement through a narrow opening in the stone wall. The moment he recognized the silhouette of a Panther, he transmitted a short, calm message over the SCR 300 radio: enemy armor. Grid 421. Moving north. Request fire. The message traveled through the Fire Direction Center in seconds. Coordinates were checked, wind data confirmed, charges selected. A battalion of 155 mm howitzers, silent minutes earlier, pivoted in unison. The German crews continued advancing, unaware that the calculations determining their fate were already complete. The first American shell landed, not on a tank, but just ahead of the lead vehicle, deliberately short. It was a ranging shot, a test. The observer adjusted slightly. The guns fired again. This time the shells struck close enough for the German column to feel the shock through the ground. Commanders scanned the horizon, searching desperately for the source. But there was nothing to see. No muzzle flash. No distant plume. Only fog, fields, and the faint echo of guns far beyond the limits of visibility. Panic rippled through the column. Orders overlapped. Engines revved. Tracks ground against frozen soil as the tanks attempted to reposition. Yet the next American salvo was already in the air, its trajectory calculated before the Germans even began to react. The battlefield shifted in an instant. What began as a routine movement had transformed into a trap, a kill zone defined not by lines on the ground, but by mathematics and timing. And the pressure was about to intensify even further. The initial shock of unseen artillery strikes quickly escalated into a decisive confrontation. German tank crews, trained for direct duels with enemy armor, were now forced to contend with a threat they could neither locate nor engage. The Panther Company near Oberkirch attempted to form defensive positions along the ridge, but every movement seemed anticipated. Each time they tried to disperse or seek cover behind hedgerows, another shell arrived precisely where they had intended to hide. American observers, working in tandem with the fire direction centers, had prepared pre-registered kill zones along likely German avenues of approach. These areas were calculated using reconnaissance maps, intelligence reports, and prior observations of German movements. When the Panther column advanced, They entered these zones exactly on schedule. The coordination between observation, calculation, and execution was seamless. At 8:17, the first truly damaging salvo struck. While no tank was destroyed outright, the concussion rattled internal equipment and stunned crews. Periscopes cracked, communications inside the hull were disrupted, and minor mechanical damage slowed movement. More importantly, the psychological impact was immediate. Crew members froze, hesitant to continue their advance. Confusion spread between vehicles. Commanders attempted to issue orders, but the overlapping noise of engines, radios, and distant artillery made coordination almost impossible. By 8:35, a second barrage landed closer, targeting the flanks of the column. Even armored veterans admitted in post-war accounts that the precision of the fire was unnerving. It was not just that shells were hitting, they were hitting where the crew had no expectation of being targeted. The Panther Company, once confident in its mobility and firepower, now advanced cautiously, unable to anticipate which square of ground would be safe. The American advantage was amplified by continuous aerial observation. Four grasshoppers hovered low over the battlefield, relaying corrections for subsequent salvos. These planes remained small and largely invisible to German tank crews, who often saw only the shell impacts but could not identify the source. Air observation allowed American artillery to strike moving targets with a level of accuracy previously thought impossible. By 9 o'clock, German commanders recognized the futility of continued forward movement. Retreat was considered, but the terrain funneled them into areas still covered by indirect fire. Hesitation was deadly. Movement was hazardous. Crews reported an unsettling sensation. They were pinned without a visible enemy. Each tank relied on instinct and training, yet instinct was now insufficient. They had entered a battlefield where information, rather than armor or gun caliber, determined survival. This confrontation was mirrored across multiple sectors. Similar scenarios played out in the approaches to the Siegfried Line, where German armor advancing under fog or snow encountered American batteries ready with pre-calculated firing zones. In every instance, the psychological effect compounded tactical disadvantage. Tanks that could easily destroy their American counterparts in a head-to-head duel were neutralized by unseen fire before they could engage. American after-action reports from February 1945 described the situation with a clinical detachment. Indirect fire had forced German armor to halt, disperse, or retreat in sectors where visibility was adequate for movement but insufficient to counter unseen guns. Observers noted that this effect was as much psychological as physical. Crews hesitated, commanders second-guessed their decisions, and operational momentum was lost. By mid-morning, the Panther Company near Oberkirch had effectively ceased its advance. Tanks occupied dispersed positions, engines running but crews immobilized by fear and confusion. Attempts to regroup were further disrupted by additional salvos calibrated from pre-surveyed positions. The American artillery network had demonstrated a decisive capability to control the battlefield beyond sight without exposing itself to counterattack. This engagement exemplified the transformation of mid-to-late war armored combat. The German reliance on direct fire and line-of-sight dominance was obsolete in the face of well-coordinated, technologically enhanced indirect fire. The result was clear. Tanks that had once been the spearhead of blitzkrieg could be neutralized by forces they could neither detect nor respond to effectively. And yet, this was not the end of the story. The immediate tactical paralysis would ripple into strategic consequences, shaping retreats, losses, and broader operational decisions, a story that continued into the aftermath. The battlefield had been irrevocably changed. The consequences of these engagements were immediate and tangible. German armored units, once feared for their aggressive maneuver tactics, found their operational options severely constrained. Crews who survived the Oberkirch confrontation reported lasting hesitation in subsequent movements. Commanders described roads that had once offered freedom of maneuver as corridors of uncertainty, where every advance carried the risk of sudden, invisible destruction. Even when no physical damage occurred, the psychological paralysis inflicted by unseen artillery had a cumulative effect on morale. Equipment losses, though not catastrophic in raw numbers for this particular engagement, were significant in terms of operational capability. Tanks immobilized by minor mechanical damage or crew hesitation could not be repositioned effectively, leaving them vulnerable to follow-up attacks or abandonment. Supply lines became more precarious as armored columns stalled or moved unpredictably, slowing fuel and ammunition distribution. Units that might have executed flanking maneuvers were forced into defensive postures, altering the tactical balance on the local front. American after-action reports emphasize the precision and efficiency of their indirect fire. Forward observers and artillery battalions successfully neutralized armored threats without exposing their positions to return fire. Pre-registered kill zones and continuous aerial observation allowed them to apply overwhelming pressure at a fraction of the risk. One report noted that the combination of surprise, precision, and timing had disrupted enemy formations before they could react, a testament to the strategic integration of technology, training, and coordination. The ripple effect extended beyond the immediate battlefield. Commanders higher up the chain in the German army became increasingly cautious, often overestimating the presence of unseen artillery. This caution slowed offensives and limited the flexibility of armored divisions. Tactical hesitation, once a minor consideration, became a systemic issue, influencing decisions across entire corps. The reliance on familiar routes and predictable movements made German armor even more vulnerable to subsequent indirect fire strikes. At the human level, the effect was stark. Tank crews reported a persistent sense of vulnerability, knowing that the battlefield itself had become a weapon against them. Diaries and post-war accounts from the period frequently described moments where entire crews froze in anticipation, scanning empty horizons for threats that could not be seen. Fear, uncertainty, and a loss of agency replaced the confidence that had characterized German armored operations earlier in the war. Meanwhile, American units gained a dual advantage, tactical and psychological. The certainty of artillery support allowed infantry to advance more boldly, armored units to maneuver with confidence, and commanders to coordinate operations without over-reliance on visual reconnaissance. The asymmetric advantage created a gap in operational tempo that German forces struggled to bridge, compounding existing logistical and manpower shortages. By the end of February 1945, these engagements had become representative of a broader trend along the Western Front. German tank crews faced the reality that even experienced, well-trained units could be paralyzed by unseen fire. The combination of American technological, tactical, and organizational superiority redefined the terms of armored warfare. Dominance no longer depended solely on direct combat, but on integrated systems capable of exerting control over the battlefield beyond human sight. The stage was set for longer-term operational consequences, including strategic withdrawals, altered defensive plans, and the eventual collapse of German armored resistance. As winter turned to early spring 1945, the broader impact of these engagements became undeniable. German armored units were no longer able to operate with the freedom and initiative that had characterized their campaigns in 1940 to 43. The lessons learned at Oberkirch and similar encounters spread quickly through the ranks, shaping doctrine, tactics, and morale. Commanders now emphasize caution over aggression, often avoiding open fields and preferring to keep tanks hidden in forests or behind urban structures. Yet even these measures could not fully mitigate the threat of precise, unseen artillery, which could be directed into any predicted route or defensive position. Casualty reports, while not always capturing the full psychological toll, highlighted the operational strain. Several Panther and Tiger units suffered immobilization due to minor mechanical failures exacerbated by artillery shockwaves. Tanks were abandoned in the field not solely because of destruction, but because crews feared moving into pre-registered artillery zones. Even minimal disruption delayed German counterattacks and reduced the effective fighting strength of entire battalions. A pattern emerged. German armor, once the spearhead of rapid offensives, became reactive and defensive, often arriving too late to influence key battles. Strategically, the German high command struggled to compensate. With limited reserves and disrupted supply lines, they could not replace lost mobility or recover the psychological initiative. Infantry units accompanying tanks faced similar difficulties. Without armored support, their exposure to indirect fire increased. The cohesion of divisions deteriorated as hesitation and fear spread, amplifying the effect of American artillery beyond the immediate area of impact. Each stalled advance or forced retreat reinforced the perception that the battlefield itself favored the Allies. American forces, by contrast, consolidated their advantage. Coordinated observation posts, precise calculation, and real-time communication allowed batteries to neutralize threats while minimizing risk to their own forces. Infantry units moved with the confidence that unseen support would cover their advance. Even when terrain seemed open and undefended, the invisible presence of artillery transformed it into a lethal environment for the enemy. Reports from forward observers praise the efficiency of this system. Enemy armor reacts before it sees us. The battlefield has become ours before engagement. The cumulative effect extended beyond individual battles. German morale suffered across the front, as crews and commanders alike internalized the reality that movement, no matter how careful, could invite devastating unseen consequences. Retreats became more orderly but also more constrained, with armored units forced into defensive postures that limited operational flexibility. Psychological attrition, combined with material shortages, meant that even successful tactical maneuvers were overshadowed by fear of unseen artillery strikes. By early 1945, these dynamics contributed directly to the collapse of German armored resistance along the Western Front. Units that might have conducted counteroffensives were constrained by the fear of being engaged from beyond sight. Operational planning increasingly focused on survival rather than initiative. The integration of technology, communication, and precision fire by American forces had fundamentally altered the nature of warfare. The unseen had become the decisive factor, and German armor, once the dominant force of Europe, could no longer impose its will on the battlefield. The aftermath of these engagements set the stage for the final Allied push into Germany, illustrating how innovation, coordination, and psychological pressure could achieve what sheer firepower alone could not. The events surrounding German tank crews frozen by unseen American artillery highlight a profound shift in the nature of warfare. Battles were no longer decided solely by the visible clash of steel and firepower. They were increasingly determined by information, coordination, and the ability to strike before the enemy could react. American forces had transformed artillery into a tool of precision and psychological dominance, turning the very terrain into an extension of their tactical planning. For the German crews, the experience was both humbling and terrifying. Tanks that had once embodied power, speed, and invincibility were suddenly vulnerable to forces they could not perceive. The fear was not only of destruction, but of helplessness, of a battlefield that seemed to anticipate every move. These moments illuminate a human dimension often overlooked in historical accounts. The psychological strain on soldiers forced to adapt to innovations that challenge their training, instincts, and confidence. From a broader perspective, these engagements demonstrate how technological mastery and disciplined coordination can redefine combat. Precision fire, forward observation, aerial spotting, and integrated communication systems allowed American forces to achieve outcomes that brute force alone could not. They exemplify a shift toward modern combined arms warfare, where dominance stems as much from data and calculation as from tanks and guns. The lessons extend beyond World War II. They illustrate the enduring principle that warfare is not only a contest of weapons, but a contest of understanding, anticipation, and adaptation. Armies that fail to account for unseen variables or underestimate the psychological impact of being exposed to an invisible threat. Risk defeat even when materially capable. In the end, the frozen German tank crews serve as a stark testament to the intersection of human experience and technological evolution in warfare. They embody a moment when history pivoted, where the battlefield itself became a weapon, and where the mastery of information, precision, and coordination determined the fate of men, machines, and nations. It was a lesson in humility, ingenuity, and the inexorable march of military innovation. The battlefield had been transformed, and the consequences reverberated far beyond the ridges of Oberkirch, shaping strategy, morale, and the course of the final months of the war.